Welcome back to M&A Plus, the art after the deal. I'm your host, Lisa Scott. Today, I'm joined by someone who brings a rare mix of legal depth, digital asset expertise, and Texas perspective to the table, Joshua Smeltzer. Joshua is a partner at Gray Reed Law Firm and has spent his career at the intersections of law, technology, and tax. From regulatory frameworks to the evolution of digital assets, his insights are both timely and practical. In today's conversation, we'll explore his journey, the current state of digital assets, M&A intersections, Texas developments, and how legal and tax issues are evolving. I'm sure you will walk away with both clarity and questions worth exploring further. Welcome to the show, Joshua. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you're on. I think you have a really unique perspective based on your background. So let's talk a little bit about your background. I'd like to know kind of how did you get into law? You know, what made you want to go into law, and how did you then, kind of get into digital assets?
Yeah, so law was actually kind of an interesting journey for me. I don't really have any professionals in my family that's mostly working class and everything along those lines. But I've always been interested in technology, and so I started at school thinking I would be a computer programmer. So I took computer programming classes. So I realized that I'm not the right personality for programming as much as I might have found it interesting. So I happened to drop a class, and it was too late to add something. So the University of Utah, where I went, had a volunteer center. I walked in there, and it just so happened that the guy working the desk that day accepting volunteers ran legal aid. And so I started at legal aid. And once I had the opportunity to go to a couple of hearings, even though they were landlord-tenant disputes, I was hooked. That's what I knew I wanted to do for the rest of my professional career. So I started preparing to go to law school, and I went to law school and was able to do everything that way. So that's what kind of got me into law and doing everything along those lines.
So it sounds like a lot of litigation then. Is that kind of what you're focused on?
That's what got me hooked at legal aid, was the hearings and standing on my feet and making the arguments. And so I actually, when I finished law school, I was lucky enough to get accepted by the DOJ through their honors program, which allows people to go directly into the DOJ straight out of law school. They don't take a lot of those people. So I got into the honors program, and it was a wonderful thing because the government allowed me to do exactly what I wanted to be able to do, which was stand on my feet and make arguments. I had passed the bar maybe 2 months. I was passing the bar. I was taking my very first deposition, and the chief of my section called me, said they were shorthanded in New Jersey. So I was going to second chair and jury trial 2 months after I passed the bar exam. So I flew to New Jersey. I had my very first jury trial. I'd only been in court one other time for a legal writing assignment. And so I got immediately. And it started a career at the Justice Department. I was able to go to trial 14 times. I've been in court hundreds of times. So yeah.
So what's it like working at the DOJ? I mean, I guess in contrast to what you're doing now.
So the DOJ, well, at the Department of Justice, you have a lot more opportunity. There aren't the same cost concerns. Also, I worked in their tax division. And so, right, every law firm and every individual and every company pays taxes. So there's a lot of cases, which gives you a lot of opportunity to do a lot of different things. The other thing that's kind of nice that I found about litigation and tax is it touches so many industries, right? In the beginning of my career, I had a lot of small businesses that were doing things, and they'd be everything: oil and gas companies, restaurants, anything along those lines. At the end of my career, I had some pretty large litigation against like General Electric, dealing with a large sale of insurance business, and then some litigation against Exxon, dealing with the dispute over sales, whether or not oil and gas contracts were sales instead of leases. So it just gave me a broad exposure to a lot of things. On the private side, you still get some of that It's just
Hmm.
not always the same kind of volume. And,
Right.
you know, my work has tend to fall into specific categories, whereas
Hmm.
I just did whatever showed up on my desk.
Wow, that's amazing background. I don't think I've ever talked to anyone that's worked in the DOJ, as a lawyer. So what is your number one expertise out of everything that you do?
I mean, at the end of the day, I am an advocate. And so I do think litigation expertise is probably the main thing that I have. And of course, right. And as a litigation person, you're being hired for your ability to make something understandable to a judge and persuasive. And what I really think I've been able to do, having spent a career in complex, financial transactions, tax transactions, and currently digital asset transactions,
Hmm.
is I've learned a way to explain things in an approachable manner because, with the digital asset industry, a lot of this is new and the tech people
Hmm.
understand it inherently. But if you have to explain it to a layman, like a judge, in order for him to make a decision that will be beneficial for the industry, for the company, for whoever you're dealing with there, it has to be explained in plain enough terms that they don't get confused and make a law based on a misinterpretation. And so I do think that like my decades of explaining tax law to non-tax lawyer judges, I think has helped me explain digital asset expertise, other things like that to people who have no exposure to digital assets.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's test you out a little bit here. So
Okay.
I would like you to explain what exactly are digital assets? What all does that include?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a variety of stuff that's here. Digital assets started with basically the blockchain technology, which is just a simple ledger. You have to keep track in a financial transaction, you have to keep track of where all the money moves, where all the value. And it's usually done on a ledger, but it's usually done by a third party and they maintain it. You have to trust that third party in order to make sure that the things are correct. And in doing that, we've seen a lot of fraud with people messing with the book, internal companies, or being hacked. Third parties are hacked, and then those people break into that system. So digital assets are just a digital representation of something of value that's kept on this blockchain distributed ledger. And the reason that that's more secure is because everyone in the network has a copy of that same ledger and the computers compare them all together. And so in order to make a change, you would have to be able to hack 51% of the network at the same time in order to make that change and get out without anyone noticing. So it's a little bit more secure. And the other thing is you don't have to rely on a third party. If you can interact directly with the blockchain, you can make a transaction on that blockchain and you don't have to worry about the honesty or trustworthiness of some third party that is entering the data onto the chain because you're doing it essentially yourself. You're involved in that transaction.
So I'm hearing that a digital asset has everything to do with what's on a blockchain, what's on a
Yeah.
blockchain, right?
Well, the blockchain is how it stores all the digital assets, right? We hear a lot of words like tokenization, and that tokenization can refer to a real world asset. But the recording of it and its authenticity and value, so what
Hmm.
you've done is you've created a digital representation of that so that that digital representation can be passed around instead of having to change the digital asset itself. And if it's not a physical asset anymore, you can break it into tinier pieces. You can
Hmm.
do all of these kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily to do with equity, right?
Right.
And I mean, cryptocurrency in particular come in all kinds of varieties. There's the Bitcoin variety that had limited amount on there in its own network, but then you have other ones that are not limited, like the meme coins that could have as many as you want.
Hmm.
There's ones that are just utility. There's ones that are just novelty. And so there's all kinds of stuff that's out there. I do think
Mhm.
that as the industry grows, some of those will disappear because they won't be interesting, or they won't be as valuable anymore. We're seeing that with NFTs. NFTs were all the rage, and now they're just not as popular. So there's not as many of
Mhm.
them out there and around.
Right. So you mentioned Bitcoin, you mentioned cryptocurrencies. Is that encompass what all digital assets are? Are the tokens
No,
and
it's right.
or
Like
what else?
they're just a piece of the pie. One,
Okay.
I said also, non fungible token, and they
Okay.
were primarily used as collectibles in the beginning. There were, you could get Bored Ape Yacht Club pictures, and there was
Like
other
NFT,
photos.
you're talking about
Yeah,
the NFTs. That's what
yeah,
it stands
which stands just for a non fungible token. It means each
for.
token itself is unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every Bitcoin is worth the same as another Bitcoin, right? It's fungible, and so it can be changed that way. But an NFT is it's a digital representation that is unique by itself.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing, originally it was collectible, but now we're seeing there are some property record municipalities and other things that are trying to incorporate NFT as the certificate of authenticity for property, which means that you wouldn't need a title company anymore necessarily, because you could exchange
Mm-hmm.
that digital version that's authentic there. Also, different other certificates of authenticity. I represented a winemaker at one point that could track origin through the NFT, because that NFT would be passed for the origin of wine, so that you could know you were getting what you did.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, no, there's a lot of different use cases that go in. So that's the non-fungible token portion.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the tokenized thing, which is a different digital asset that represents, potentially it could represent just right the revenue or share in a company or a partnership and other things like that. So there's a lot of digital assets. Cryptocurrencies make the news because they're the ones that everybody sees, the Bitcoin and the other things like that. And they have their place. But digital assets is definitely much broader as a term.
So I know that there's different classifications of different things, and I'm kind of going into tax now. So
Sure.
depending on what something's classified as by the IRS will depend on how the tax treatment is, or how you might
Mm-hmm.
have to pay tax on certain things. So, like for example, Bitcoin, as I understand it, if I buy Bitcoin and sell it, I have to pay the capital gains tax if I made money off of that purchase and sold the Bitcoin, and that would be taxable as a capital gain, right?
Yeah.
So is that true with all the digital assets, or how are things classified, and kind of how are they classified now? And do you see those classifications changing over time?
Yeah. So the IRS in 2014 classified cryptocurrency as essentially personal property. And that's why you're seeing that, because other personal property, for example, a stock, right, is property. And if you own that, that operates exactly the same way. If you buy it at one price and sell it at a higher price, you pay tax on the difference in those prices there. And that's primarily how cryptocurrencies have always been, treated by the IRS. But that's because that guidance came out in 2014. At the time in 2014, there weren't a lot of even on the market. Most notably, Ethereum wouldn't show up until 2015. So, one of the largest market share cryptocurrencies, Ethereum, it wasn't even around when the guidance was put out there as well. The other thing is the reason that the IRS chose not to treat it as a currency was because it said in the notice that no country accepted Bitcoin as legal tender, so it couldn't be a currency. Well, that's not true anymore. There's El Salvador and one other African nation that both accept it as legal tender. So I do think that eventually both the IRS and a lot of the federal agencies that have kind of incorporated definitions that are now old and potentially outdated, they're going to have to make a determination on whether or not they still want to treat them that way. I think the first fight that we're having right now in the cryptocurrency, kind of in the tax space, about how you tax it, is on staking reward.
Oh,
That's the
staking.
litigation that's happening right now. For Bitcoin miners, if you do a proof of work system, which this basically is, right, you're all competing to get the right to verify a transaction, and they do that with complicated math problems and everything like that. But if you win the raffle, so to speak, of being able to validate a transaction, so you solve the math problem, you get your reward. And the IRS says the minute you have that control of that award, it's now income to you. Now, with staking reward, there is some litigation going on right now where they're saying that they shouldn't have to pay tax on the staking rewards immediately, right? And they're using it one example they're using is like a farmer. The farmer doesn't have to, they don't have to pay tax on their apples until they sell them, right? And so they had a tree, it produced apples, but until they sell them, they don't have income. And they're trying to distinguish staking from that because you have the cryptocurrency, you're staking it on the blockchain in order to, keep the security of that and everything along those. There's benefits to that. But it then generates, income through these rewards. And so they're trying to do it. But right now, the way that they are, if you have control of a staking reward, you are taxed immediately. So that's the current fight that I see happening in the courts. And we'll see whether or not the courts are willing to kind of take a broader view of what shouldn't be income. And we may end up seeing a court revisit the IRS's 2014 interpretation now that it's, many years later and the world has kind of changed.
Right. That's a long time ago, actually.
Yeah.
Over 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a common question that comes up about, what's the difference and why do I have to pay tax on it? Because, you're right. Bitcoin, especially to me, is starting to feel like a currency more than a property.
The one benefit to taxpayers now is for the longest time, you had to keep track of this all by yourself. But at least now, most of the major exchanges started doing it anyway. But the IRS is now saying that if you're dealing in this, you have to send the taxpayers what you would normally get from your bank, which is a 1099 that at least lays out the stuff for you. Now,
right.
If the law changes, then they'll do it differently. But for right now, the taxpayer, thankfully, don't have to figure that out if they're using a Coinbase or a Kraken or one of these other exchanges.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Texas. There's a lot of stuff going on in Texas. You wrote an article, I think it was in Forbes, about Texas. It seems like Texas has a lot of advantages for business, especially businesses that are involved in digital assets. There's been a lot of initiatives like the Texas Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, the Texas Stock Exchange. What do you think about Texas? And are they really a front runner? Is Texas setting an example for the rest of the country, or kind of what's the impact?
So, yes. So Texas has kind of been unique in being kind of at the right place at the right time. And they had been doing the right things before that. So Texas has always been a business-friendly state, right? It goes easy on regulation of businesses. It doesn't have extensive regulation as some other states might have. So that's always been true. And they continue to do that. In the Forbes article that you were referencing, I mentioned a bunch of legislative proposals that had come up to make it easier and their board of directors to make decisions without fear of shareholders. They had limited shareholders to you had to have at least a significant interest in the company to file them. And they had codified a business judgment rule so that you have to overcome a presumption that something wasn't in the best interest of the company as opposed to fighting about it. It was going to start as a presumption that the board of directors was acting in the best interest of the company. So those are some business things that were in addition to what Texas has already done. They've always offered a lot of tax incentives for people to move their corporate headquarters, and it resulted in a lot of corporate headquarters moving to Texas, specifically in Dallas. Right, you had Toyota move from California, Goldman Sachs is moving out of New York. I mean, Elon Musk moved. We've had some really sizable companies. Caterpillar moved here. A whole bunch of companies have moved here just for that good business. Now, I think the other thing, so you have this really good business climate that's there as well. And the other thing that happened is Texas kind of embraced digital assets early. And that's because a lot of the early digital asset companies were mining Bitcoin. And what they happened to need was cheap energy sources and land to stick their Bitcoin miners on. And Texas had both. They had a deregulated energy system, which was important for them because when the price of Bitcoin is high, they want to mine. But when it's low, they don't. But if they had purchased energy credits and the price was low and they didn't want to mine, they could sell them back to the grid. And that would often allow them to stay solvent until the Bitcoin price went up. This system is not unique to Texas because it had to be put in place for oil, because the price of a barrel of oil as it goes up and down determines how much oil they're going to pump out of the ground. And so Bitcoin mining kind of operated the same, where you have this asset that fluctuates in price such that everybody has to kind of wait out the bad periods and, flourish in the high period. So it just ended up being a really unique place for the first set of kind of digital asset companies to come in. So then the next wave of digital assets that we're seeing now are financial products that are essentially just taking the traditional financial product we have and turning them into digital form. And Dallas is unique for that as well, right? We've got a lot of finance there, and then Goldman Sachs is moving in, Texas Stock Exchange is moving in, the New York Stock Exchange is moving in, NASDAQ is moving in. So all of a sudden, you have this kind of financial district evolving around in an environment that's already familiar with digital assets. And so that was kind of my point, that I feel like Texas in particular is uniquely situated to be able to take advantage of this kind of upswing we're seeing in new AI, other emerging technologies, and digital asset companies. Like there's just a lot of them starting right now, and they're looking for a good place to put down roots. And Texas just happens to be a very unique situation. A really good place.
Yeah. And things are evolving so much. So, like from a business person's perspective, what are some of the legal challenges that a business should be aware of in this sort of new digital asset environment?
Sure. So the one thing that you always have to think about, the first thing the business owner has to do, they already have to set up something so they have the product or the service and they know they can offer it in a profitable way, right? So once you have that out of the way, now you put things on the market. The minute you have to put things on the market, now you have to worry about all the regulatory stuff that comes in, right? Because every state, even Texas, even though it's a light touch, I believe, everybody has a regulatory environment. And it's not that we don't want that to completely disappear because it weeds out fraud. And that's good for business owners because, right, if somebody is operating a fraudulent business and you're trying to do things on the straight and narrow, you're at a competitive disadvantage if that person never has to pay the piper for what they're doing, right? So you want the rules to be fair, both for the business owner and to protect the consumers of whatever is being. You have to deal with the regulatory regime. Right now, I think business owners are facing two kind of uphill battles with the regulatory regime. And one, this regulatory regime was never built to deal with digital assets. It just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And while some
Good
things
point.
can, some things can transfer without much hassle, other things really require their own rules. And those are just, they just haven't been written. And I
Mm-hmm.
think part of that is because of an unfamiliarity with digital assets. The other part is that government right now, both at the federal and state level, have they've experienced a lot of pullback on the employees that they have. And so they don't have a lot of people there to write rules anyway. And they have this new regime that needs to happen. I was saying to someone the other day that, we have a friendlier federal executive now for digital assets. But I still feel like government is still the problem, though, because I'm right, like in the tax sphere in particular, 40% of the IRS, the DOJ tax division, like 40% of it's gone because of the offers for people to retire early and just
Mm-hmm.
normal things that were going in regular attrition. So, all of a sudden we have a friendly executive, but nobody there to write rules or provide guidance or do any of that kind of stuff, or less people, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
not as much can get done during a time when we have kind of a friendlier government for digital assets. And so that is a little bit of a concern, I think, right now, is that everybody was hoping for the ability to get a lot of guidance and rules, and it just, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not sure if we're going to happen. We have a new stablecoin bill, which is great, but right, they also reintroduced another Bitcoin bill that would provide a whole bunch of clarity, de minimis exceptions for tax, so that you could spend the Bitcoin without having to
Mm-hmm.
worry about having to keep track of your capital gains. All of those things are pending, and even if they do get passed, the rules for that would have to be written by a government agency that
Right.
have all watched.
So I went to the Bitcoin conference. I've been around the Bitcoin crowd. And I guess, is it true that you can own your Bitcoin and you literally don't need anybody else? You don't need a government. You don't need a bank. It's yours and it's a sovereign thing. I mean, what is your view on that?
It absolutely is. So, Bitcoin is very unique in that way. It started in 2008 and nobody really paid attention to its existence. And so people started joining the network, exchanging it back and forth and doing it. And by the time that somebody started to actually look at it government wise, it was already so large that there's not really anything that anybody could do about it. It was there and there's nothing you
Mm-hmm.
can, do about it. And so it's its own sovereign thing. It's like electricity. It's just out there. The only limitation to that, in theory, that's true. The only limitation to that, I think, is the technology is not at a point where people can conveniently interact with the actual blockchain. And so most people who are buying cryptocurrencies or have them, most of them use an exchange, which is a third party, and they have a wallet that's on an exchange as well. The minute you do that, that company is subject to a government, right? Because they
Right.
licensed themselves, they agreed to certain rules, they can't operate their business without following certain regulations and other things like that.
Hmm.
But the technology is there such that you or I could go on to the Bitcoin network. We could buy a Bitcoin, sell a Bitcoin, do some other exchange on that network, all on our own, should we be technologically savvy enough to do it. And we wouldn't need a Coinbase. We wouldn't need anything other than our own connection to the internet. That's really empowering. And I think it's why we're seeing adoption in some other countries where their banking systems aren't as stable, because it's giving some countries access to the US dollar that never would have had it otherwise.
Hmm.
And that can be truly transformative for some people who live in nations where their currencies are just devalued regularly. No stability in their finance.
Hmm.
Right. You can use a stable coin and you can buy it, and you now have access to the US dollar. Or you can use Bitcoin, which has its own value, and trade that way. So yeah, no, there is some to that.
Hmm.
But there's pros and cons to that too, because if you are your own bank and you're in charge of all your own value, I mean, there's nobody protecting you in any way,
Hmm.
shape, or form. When there's lots of Bitcoin that is currently stranded because people lost it by being their own bank and by keeping it on their own bank, right? Like as a society, we rely on third parties quite a lot to keep track of us, maintain our password protection when we forget what we did,
Right.
and
Hmm.
all that kind of stuff. And so there is a system where you could do all of that yourself, but it comes with all the risks of doing that.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mergers and acquisitions. So I know you also list on your long bio that you've also been involved in merger and acquisition work, and I'd like to get your opinion on kind of, why M&A has been so slow the last few couple of years and kind of where you see it going in the future in general, and also as it relates to this new digital asset world that we're in. Kind of what is your view on that?
Sure. So I feel like deal work's been down for a while. And I think the reason that it has is because we've experienced so much uncertainty over the last few years, right? Like we had the whole pandemic that I mean, investors and people, doing deals, they like certainty, right? You're not able to get as much as you ever want, but they do a lot of due diligence. They like a lot of certainty in, where interest rates are going, how borrowing's going to work, what are asset fluctuations, how stable the industry they're buying into is. And we just didn't have a lot of that, not throughout all of the pandemic. And then we've just had this roller coaster of economy over the last few years. And I think that's what's happened is anyone who could kind of sit on their hands and wait it out was doing it.
Hmm.
I think this year we've seen a slight uptick in deal work, and I haven't yet formed an opinion of whether or not I believe that people just can't wait anymore, or or if they feel like it's a little bit more certain, and
Hmm.
they feel more comfortable doing deals in this scenario. I do think with some of these rate cuts we've seen recently, we might see the real estate industry, which is one of the biggest when it comes to the deals. I think we may see some real estate deals start to happen, and hopefully that'll be a catalyst for more going on. For the digital asset realm, we're seeing this new breed I don't know that we'll see a whole lot of mergers and acquisitions. We're seeing some IPOs with big companies, right? Like we're starting to see that. So maybe we'll see some mergers and acquisitions. I think that maybe is still a couple of years off. What I think the next biggest, newest fad right now are treasury strategies for existing companies. So a lot of companies are saying to themselves, okay, well, I'm not really a Bitcoin company, but I'm going to create my own kind of treasury strategy and maintain Bitcoin on my balance sheet as an offset against inflation and all the other benefits that come with owning Bitcoin, in addition to just it's an asset that tends to increase in value, right? The next thing that comes is the minute you want to sell your company now you have this incredibly volatile store of asset that could be enormous that's now part of the deal. And so I think that will be very interesting the first time somebody goes to buy a oil and gas business that just happens to have $30 million worth of Bitcoin as a treasury store in its company, right? And how you deal with that. Will we deal with it like it's just a market price? Will there be something in the deal document that factors in the potential for Bitcoin to, devalue? Because deals take a long time and Bitcoin changes price daily, right? And so I do think there'll be some interesting things as lawyers like me figure out what terms we're going to put in these agreements to deal with the volatility of that asset as it goes on. When it's not a large part of the company's asset, it's not as big of a deal. But if companies are going to start having these treasury strategies where they're holding millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, then all of a sudden you have this multi-million-dollar asset that fluctuates greatly over time while you're trying to work out a deal. So I do think that will be interesting.
I guess it depends on how short or long-term thinking the buyer is as to how valuable that would be.
Yep.
Good. So I have a few rapid fire questions for you.
All right.
So let's see what kind of answers we get for these. So the first one is most overlooked digital asset tax trap.
I think that what the most overlooked one for individuals is that they don't realize how much gain they're generating themselves by day trading. There's a lot of day trading that goes on. And then at the end of the year, they realize what a headache it is to try and keep track of all those capital gains that are in there. The other thing is you can't pay your taxes in cryptocurrency. So all of a sudden you've created a lot of gain by selling a bunch of stuff with no actual money to do it unless you sell more cryptocurrency and convert it to fiat. So I do think that's an individual tax trap. For companies, I think one of the biggest tax traps that they need to remember is that just keeping that asset on your balance sheet can cause all kinds of tax problems for accounting for it, especially in partnerships where you have individual capital accounts and you have to make these mark-to-market elections and other things along those lines. If you have Bitcoin in that mix, there's a lot of them that you could do. And the more partners you have, the more you could create yourself a very large accounting.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Probably one.
Right. Okay. So next question. What's your favorite tax case you ever litigated?
My favorite tax case that I ever litigated was out in Lubbock, Texas. And it was dealing with an insurance product that was being sold at the time for there. But it was really interesting. It was the very first, truly, really, really complex case that I dealt with. And I had a hedge fund manager that was an expert on my case. I had an insurance expert. I had a forensic accountant that had worked on the Bernie Madoff stuff. I learned so much in that case, and that's why I liked it. It was so complex, and there were so many things to keep track of. I was grateful I had experts to help guide me through it, but I don't think I learned. I think that's the most I've ever learned while litigating a case was that
Mhm.
particular insurance.
So do lawyers today need to become more multidisciplinary?
I wonder about that because I have always loved that I have my hands in different things, right? Like I do tax, I do digital assets, I also do corporate work. And even my tax practice, I have both civil and criminal cases that I handle
Mm.
for both of that. But I mean, I do think it's worthwhile to do that, but I think it depends on the firm because if you're Gray Reed, it has 166 attorneys, so it's not small, but
Mhm.
it's also not over 1,000 attorneys. And I feel like if you work for one of these really large firms, you have to be doing a very, very narrow thing just because of how many attorneys are there and just the logistics don't work for that. So I think if you like being multidisciplinary,
Mhm.
you could try and find yourself a mid-sized firm where that's possible. And
Mhm.
if you don't mind just being the expert on the taxation of soap bubbles, then you should go to a large firm because they'll be able to fit you into that and you'll be able to help with that as well. I think it mostly matters on the firm.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So finish the sentence. 2030 will be.
2030 will be, you know what I'm going to go with? 2030 will be fine. I hear so many people
Mhm.
nowadays feeling like the end is near. And I don't take that view. Our country and the people in it have always been really smart, really practical, and really helpful. And so I feel like everyone believes we're on the edge of a cliff. And so they probably believe by 2030 we're over. So I'm going to go on record in 2030, we're all going to be fine.
Right. It's like we were
We're
all
all going
fine
to
in
be
year 2000 when the
fine.
world was going to end
Yeah,
because of the
yeah,
year 2000.
yeah, it's all going to be fine. I think we could all benefit from just taking a nice deep breath and realizing that we've been through a lot of crap and we've always survived it. We could survive this one too. That's all.
Hmm.
Whatever it is that's
Okay.
troubling you,
Right.
you will survive it. It will be okay. And we'll be all
And if you don't survive it, you won't remember it anyway.
fine. Exactly. So it doesn't matter anyway.
So where can somebody find you? I know you have a lot of writings or publications, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of your information is really interesting. I know you have the Forbes article, and I
Yep.
saw a lot of writings that you did on your law firm website. But where can people generally find your publications and contact you if they wanted to get in touch?
Sure. So I'm available on LinkedIn and I post pretty regularly. And so LinkedIn, if I have a Forbes article, it's on LinkedIn. If we have a blog post, it's
Mm.
on LinkedIn as well. And I also just I post and comment on other things that go on in that. It is I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I come home, I'm the same as everybody else. My brain is, already tired. And so, no, I don't want to sit down and do any more work. So what I do is I just get on LinkedIn and I scroll there, and that's when I start
Mm-hmm.
commenting on people. So I'm pretty active on it because it's essentially that is my 1 hour television drama is scrolling through LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is a
Right.
great place to get me. Also, Forbes Smelter is not a very common name, so if you just Google Forbes as Smelter, then I'll come up, and you can follow me on Forbes, and you'll get any articles that I run on there. That's the platform where you can get they're easily digestible stuff. It's usually a 5 to 7 minute read on those where you can get those topics as well. LinkedIn, you'll sometimes see a scholarly article that I write that's a little bit longer.
Mhm.
Before it was usually a pretty quick read and pretty recent,
Right.
headline, I think.
And you've got a lot of stuff on digital assets. You have a lot of stuff on kind of what Texas is doing. A lot of
Yep.
stuff on M&A too.
Yes.
So there's
Really.
quite a variety of of, topics that you've covered. So that's
Yeah. The firm's blog is called Dollars and Cents, Sense. And so it basically, I've always been really interested in just kind of financial
Mhm.
transactions, and anything like that. I mean, the reason I like tax is just because anytime money moves, there's usually some form of tax consequence. And so it allows you to be involved in a huge variety of financial transactions. And I find financial transactions very interesting. It's how I originally got into digital assets because it was this new financial transaction that I'd never heard of. And so I just fell kind of down the rabbit hole trying to figure out what it was and how it fit into everything else I knew. And so
Yeah.
it was very fun.
I'm sure you're going to be busy.
That's
You're,
probably true.
you're not going to be less busy.
Yep. Very good.
So that was a very insightful conversation. I really appreciate how you cut through the noise to highlight what matters most, from the realities of regulation to where digital assets may be heading in the years ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow M&A Plus, The Art After the Deal, wherever you get your podcasts. All our podcasts are available in the resources section at intoedge.com. Thank you for tuning in. And Joshua, thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us. Bye for
Thank
now.
you.